Hello guys and gals, and welcome! So today we're going to be doing the last episode of the Merc Guides. This is going to be the Barbarian Merc Guide. Now it is important that you note that we are going to have to separate this out into two different Merc Guides for the Barbarian Merc, and they'll be in the same video, but if you don't want to hear about the Act 2 two-handed version, and it's very important, so the two-handed version and the one-handed dual-wield version, it's kind of weird to say that one-handed dual wield, but the dual wield version cannot use two-handed swords, despite the fact that barbarians can use two-handed swords as one-handed weapons. So there's like a whole split between these two particular barbarians. So we're going to be covering the two-handed variant first. The two-handed variant uses bash, stun, and battle cry. Battle cry is pretty useful to reduce the defense of monsters, which is pretty nice. Other than that, they're actually far less customizable than the latter, which is the one-handed dual wield version. The one-handed dual wield version just has a lot more utility than the two-handed version. However, the two-handed version does excel at one thing, which is basically being a tank. So if what you want is just like a god tier tank, the two-handed version is actually pretty good at that. It's actually for a couple reasons, but one of the main reasons is literally just he has the stun ability, which stuns things, and bash knocks back targets. So a lot of the times when he's fighting a monster, especially when he's fighting melee monsters, he will be knocking them back a lot, knocking them back, stunning them, and basically dishing out, multiple ways that he can apply crowd control effects. He has no weapon on right now, by the way, but he's still in there just tanking away. But before we talk about the Act 2 Mercenary, or even the Dual Wield Mercenary, there's a couple things we got to talk about first. Now, building a mercenary is generally revolving around one of three types of builds. This is the For the Merc build. For the Merc basically means that you're building a mercenary to be the best he can be. And the reason why this is important is because generally this type of build structure forgoes any consideration to the player. This is about getting the mercenary to be as strong as the mercenary can be, irregardless of you. Now, the problem with this build style is, of course, is that most people generally don't like to do this build style, but this build style can be extremely effective if you are having trouble keeping your mercenary alive, which a lot of the times, building this particular style makes for the tankiest, the best, and the strongest mercenary, but not necessarily the most utilitarian mercenary or the tankiest mercenary, just simply the best mercenary overall. Now, a tank, that's really obvious. Your goal with your tank is to have a mercenary that stays alive. That's literally the most important thing about being a tank, is that he stay alive. If he doesn't stay alive, then he's a bad tank, and, well, then poo-poo on him. And then the third form is utility. Utility is basically how can the Merc be useful to me? To me, question mark with exclamation point with all capital letters. And one thing I'll tell you right off the bat, the Act 5. I'm gonna do that all stream long, all video long. By the way, I keep because he's the two-handed mercenary, and I keep saying Act 2 for some reason. The Act 5 two-handed variant is not the best for utility. If you want a utility Act 5 mercenary, definitely go with the Frenzy. So what does the Act 5? I told you I was going to do it. Act 5 two-handed mercenary. What is he good for? Well, he can have some utility as well, but generally you have to set him up for damage output. Now, the real big problem with this is that he needs life leech to stay alive. And without life leech, he's kind of just like up the creek without a paddle. Which means that things like Voice of Reason, which is an item that has a particularly nice amount of cold damage and freezing effects, is not going to be very useful for him, because you see how the actual on hit damage is only 35 to 40. That's the part that actually does the life leech. So weapons like Voice of Reason, weapons like Lawbringer, weapons like, yeah, there's a lawbringer right there. Weapons like that are going to be generally poo-pooed upon, and they're not going to be really all that great for them because it really just don't have a lot of actual damage output, which means that the mercenary just doesn't get a lot of HP in return, and this can be definitely a bad thing. Now, there's a lot of really good options for the Barb Merc, and before we get into that, I actually do have some Barb Merc testing that I'm going to show you guys. So, I actually did a video a little while ago. If you guys haven't seen it, you can check it out. But I did a whole lot of testing on raw damage output, and I think that's really important that I highlight this testing to specifically say raw damage output. And you might be wondering what raw damage output means. Well, it's basically the idea of how much damage can I put out, like irrespective of any other type of modifier, like no crushing blow. We're not worried about stacking our attack speed to the moon and back. We're not worried about like tons of different factors. All we're trying to see is how long does it take us to kill a monster with just like as much raw damage output as we can potentially make. Now, in this testing, I did want to get one thing out of the way, which for the longest time, Head Striker had been ahead of Grief in terms of damage calculations, and I wanted to make sure that that was still the fact before I reported this video, and it doesn't look like it is. So there basically is a bug within the game that allows Head Striker to essentially double its modifiers. It's like max damage modifier. It also has deadly strike, 148% deadly strike, by the way, on the two-handed mercenary. So it basically allows the two-handed mercenary to get a better effectiveness out of a one-handed sword due to the doubling effect. Now, I don't know if the doubling effect was destroyed at some point. Maybe the developers decided they didn't like it or something, but I did a test, and basically what I determined is that a two-handed barb with a head striker was doing about killing Uber Diablo at about 18 minutes and 10 seconds, and a two-handed barb with Grief was about 11 minutes and 22 seconds. Now, this does mean that the Grief is a higher damage output on the Act 2 Barb Merc than, Act 5 two-handed Barb Merc. I told you I was going to do that all video long. Than the Head Striker. However, another thing that you have to take into account with these tests is because these are raw damage tests and not actually, trying to figure out exactly how fast you can kill a monster. Because as an example, if I set up a character with like a large amount of crushing blow, I could probably kill Uber Diablo in 40 to 60 seconds, not 18 minutes, not 11 minutes. So even Grief's 11 minutes and 22 seconds is, as I would put it, still basically garbage without CB, right? So raw damage output isn't really the best characteristic to consider here because crushing blow is also extremely important. And you might be wondering, well, what does high CB get you? Well, the faster, if you get high crushing blow, you'll kill tough, high HP monsters faster. This is something that you're going to do with high crushing blow. High raw damage is going to get you low HP, relatively weak monsters killed faster. Which basically means that utilizing a Grief on a two-handed Barbarian Mercenary is going to get you that quick, easy monster kills, but it's going to be relatively crappy when you come across a monster that has really high damage or high HP, right? So the higher the HP, the worse Grief is going to do, and the worse Head Striker can do. However, Head Striker does have a advantage over Grief, which Grief does not have, which is that you could potentially put a Burr Rune in it, and you could add in Crushing Blow. So you can have an extra 20% CB added on to the Crushing Blow, and you could throw on like a G-Face, which would get him up to a pretty nice 55% Crushing Blow on this particular card. However, if you wanted Crushing Blow, the Head Striker Conquest Sword with a Burr Rune in it isn't the best option either. And let's talk about those options, shall we, for the two-handed variant of this. So the two-handed variant has very few options for weapons because he has to actually dish out damage. So things like Voice of Reason, things like Lawbringer, those are out, which leaves the best options basically for this mercenary are things like Grief, obviously, because you get large amounts of raw damage, Head Striker, which is large amounts of raw damage, and some additional Crushing Blow if you throw a Burr Rune in there. And then you can also put on a really expensive option, which is a Last Wish in a Colossus Blade. You could also potentially put in Last Wish in a Phase Blade. Now, let's talk about the reasons why you might do one or the other really quickly. Now, obviously, Last Wish is very, very expensive. It is Ja, Mal, Job, Sir, Ja, Burr. However, the difference between putting a Last Wish in a Phase Blade and putting a Last Wish in a Colossus Blade is a pretty massive increase in damage output. As you can see, you get 426 to 822 two-handed damage with a Last Wish Colossus Blade in an ethereal form. However, you will now no longer be able to use that on any other character except for this Barbarian Mercenary. So you're kind of stuck, like if you put it on the Barb Merc. However, it's going to be an absolutely impressive and absolutely crazy weapon for this particular mercenary. The Last Wish in the Phase Blade is going to be far less damage output. As you can see here, we have a damage output of 2,042 to 2,255, whereas with the Last Wish in the Colossus Blade, you have 4,484 to 8,214. And the other thing that makes this weapon absolutely insane is that it also gives the level 17 Might Aura, which means your mercenary now has a huge bump in his physical damage output. He's got Life Tap, he's got Fade, he's got 70% Crushing Blow, Hit Blinds Target, which is also pretty powerful to help keep him alive and you alive. And just in general, I think Last Wish is probably the best weapon for this mercenary, pretty much bar none. And the reason why is because he has very few options in terms of like his Crushing Blow that he can have on his character. And obviously, as you can see here, he's at 105% Crushing Blow with this setup. So not only does he have insane damage output with this setup, but he also has 105% Crushing Blow with this setup. And he's pretty much just going to annihilate pretty much anything he comes across. I'm pretty sure he could even kill Uber Diablo with relative ease. We can always, we could always play around with it and just see how he does. But let's go play, shall we? The real problem with that, though, is that you can't share that with any other character, right? So if you make it in a Phase Blade, you can share it with pretty much every other character that you've got. So if you want to share it with your your Paladin, or you want to put it on your Barbarian, or you want to throw it on the 5 dual-wield version. There's 1,000 different reasons why you would have a very nice time utilizing the Last Wish Phase Blade on multiple characters across the board, as opposed to simply utilizing the Last Wish non-Phase Blade version. And of course, I'm dying horribly. Hold on. I have a secret to be able to stand here and just not do anything. The secret sauce. It's called an absolutely broken Tyrael's Might. Look at this. It has no other purpose other than to just basically make me invincible, so I don't have to worry about, like dying or anything, which is actually extremely useful when you're doing tests and things like that. But this is definitely going to be like the highest damage output version of this particular mercenary, and it really just has to do with the fact that you've got really high damage output, raw damage, and you also get really high damage output, Crushing Blow, as well as you also get a form of. Do we have open wounds? I don't think we do have open wounds. I think that's an issue. So we probably would want to throw like, because he is regenerating. Here, I can apply open wounds myself here. I put 100% open wounds on the Tyrael's Might just to make sure that I could maintain the open wounds while the Barb is fighting. Oh, he got killed. Still did pretty decent damage there, as you can see, despite the fact that he died. He was able to dish out more than 75% of the monster's HP with within a relatively short period of time. He probably would have killed him too, honestly, if I had remembered to apply open wounds. Which, let's go do that again, but let's actually apply the open wounds this time. Now, Last Wish is like an all-in-one package. That's one of the coolest things about it. You get, obviously, the Fade proc. You also get all of the beautiful life tap. You get the Might Aura. It makes him a very effective utility character. It's probably one of the only ways, honestly, that you're actually going to have a utility character or a utility mercenary with the Act 2 version. Is basically this particular setup. Because without the Last Wish, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And I think that's one of the biggest problems for the Act 5 two-handed variant, is that they have a lot of trouble, basically having their cake and eat it too, which is getting the damage output that they need while also having the utility that you would like to have. And it is a particularly nice damage output, though. 4,484 to 8,214 is kind of hard to beat. If you throw a grief on him, for instance, he's only at 3,541 to 3,628. He is going to be much faster, though, which is also another thing to take into account, is the speed. And that's one of the best things about the phase blades, is that they are extremely fast weapons, which does make them very good for proccing effects. Now, we've talked about the weapons for the Barbarian Mercenary. Let's talk about his helmet and his armor options. So if you want to apply open wounds with the Mercenary, there's a couple ways that you can do it. You can obviously use a duress, but I actually prefer the bone flesh in most situations, because duress doesn't have any life leech. So if you're in a situation where you don't have any life leech, like, I don't know, let's say you're using a head striker with a burr rune, which is obviously going to be much cheaper than a a Last Wish, as an example. And also, it's just such a sad thing to make the Last Wish in the Colossus Blade, because you're basically just stuck using that on only that Barbarian Mercenary, which is really sad. So Bone Flesh is going to get you that open wounds, and it's also going to get you the life stolen per hit, which is really nice. But the other really nice thing about Bone Flesh over something like Duress is you also get a socket, which you can add a jewel to. So you're going to get like a 15% IAS jewel, or you can even add increased resistances, like a 15 all res jewel or something like that. There's a lot of different options you could potentially do here. You could also potentially put a burr rune in there if you're really rich, and you can add an additional damage reduction. You could also throw in a shale rune, which is going to help with faster hit recovery. The Bone Flesh, especially when it's upgraded and ethereal, it offers a very effective mercenary option, which is useful. Sorry. Got a frog in my throat. Which is useful when you don't want to use a life leech helmet. And since a lot of the mercenary's damage output is going to be coming from Crushing Blow and Deadly Strike, G-Face is a very excellent option for the mercenary. So if you are utilizing, for instance, a G-Face on your Barbarian Merc, something like Bone Flesh comes in really handy to get you the additional life leech that you need. It also adds in the open wounds so that you've got your Crushing Blow, your Deadly Strike, and your open wounds all in one nice, neat little package. You can also throw, obviously, a 15% IS jewel in your G-Face, which is pretty nice as well, and offers a very nice damage output package for the Merc. Now, Fortitude is a much better option in terms of tankiness, because it does, of course, offer the chilling armor proc, which is going to give him a huge defense bonus. Unlike the dual wield variant, he doesn't have iron skin, so he doesn't really have the best defense. And so things like Fortitude are actually really good for this particular character, not only to increase his raw damage output, but also just in general to make him just tankier, so that he's not getting hit as often. You can also cheaply use things like Treachery. Treachery is a decent little armor for him as well. Treachery gives, of course, the Fade proc, and it also gives Venom, and 45% increased attack speed. So if you're trying to get like a cheap armor just to give him, for early on, Treachery is really hard to beat. One of the problems that I have with Treachery is that the Fade sometimes will not proc by the time you get to your destination. So if you're one of those people that really likes to, what's the term, do fast runs, where you basically come in to a game, like, I don't know, maybe you're farming like Pindle or something, and you farm Pindle over and over again. There's a very good chance that the Treachery is not even going to proc before you kill Pindle. But if you're doing longer runs, Treachery is a much better option, because the longer runs, you're pretty much always going to get your Fade to proc at some point, and he will be pretty tanky as soon as he gets his Fade proc. It's also, of course, a very nice plate just simply to give him a very fast attack speed. If you're utilizing something like a Phase Blade, like Grief and a Phase Blade, The speed of grief is really, really fast, and you don't really need the increased attack speed. But if you're utilizing a slower weapon, the increased attack speed will come in handy quite a bit. Other helmet options and armor options are things like Chains of Honor, of course. Chains of Honor is actually a pretty good competition for Fortitude, even though it doesn't have the defense increase. It does, however, have a huge damage bonus of demon damage and undead damage, which can give a pretty large percentage of increase there. You also get physical damage reduction, and you get all resistances, and it's generally just a really nice plate for a lot of mercenaries as well as players. It's kind of hard to beat Chains of Honor, to be perfectly honest. Other helmet options are things like the Cure helmet, which is really nice if you're set up for a utility setup, which is going to get you obviously your regeneration, your anti-curse and anti-poison field, which you don't get any regeneration because you're not on the prayer merc. But if you utilize this helmet, you're not going to have any life leech. If you don't have any life leech on your weapon, you're going to need to get life leech on your armor, and so utilizing the cure is probably going to draw you back to something like the bone flesh or the chains of honor. These two life leech armors are both pretty good. It really depends on what you're trying to set up your merc for. As I've said previously, though, when it comes to utility, I think you're far better off with the two-handed, or sorry, the one-handed dual wield version. Another interesting option for the helmets is Ariad's Face. Ariad's Face does offer a lot of bonuses like strength, dexterity. You can obviously socket it, so you can customize it with like an IAS jewel, or throw like a bourbon in there for damage reduction, or various other things. It's actually a pretty surprisingly good piece for the Barb Merc. I do, however, think that the bulwark is better for the most part, and it's really just due to the fact that it has life leech and it has damage reduction innately of 15% DR. So you get your faster hit recovery, you get your life leech, you get your physical damage reduction and damage reduced by 7, all in one nice little package. And you also get a nice increase to his life as well. And while you are missing out on the resistances with Bulwark, I do feel like Bulwark just in general is a stronger helmet for Mercenary these days than even like Ariad's Face. It really just depends on, are you hitting your caps on your resistances? If you are, then you don't need the resistances that come from Ariad's Face. The dex and strength are nice, but they don't really do that much unless you need them to hit a specific armor or something like that, or a weapon stat requirements. And then the helmet is still really nice because it's customizable. So if you have a good jewel or a good gem or something like that, or a rune to put in the Ariad's Face, it can still compete very well with Bulwark, especially in the ethereal status, because of course you get like 756 defense as opposed to 500. All in all, with this mercenary, I don't really recommend this merc over the others, and it really just comes down to the fact that I think the dual wield version is just far superior to the two-handed variant, mainly just because you can have so much more customizability with the two-handed or the dual wield version. And speaking of the dual wield version, let's go check out the dual wield version real quick, and we're going to talk about that one. We're also going to talk about the tests I did for the dual wield version to give you an idea of damage output and what the best combos are. All right, so a couple various things about the dual wield version that need to be talked about. First off, they cannot use two-handed weapons. I did talk about this earlier in the stream, but let's talk about it again just to be 100% sure. So if you take a two-handed weapon and you try and put it on the mercenary, he is incapable of wearing it. So something like the Last Wish Colossus Blade, although it is amazing, cannot be used by the Act 5 one-handed dual wield version. Why does it have to be so complicated? So if you were going to make something like Last Wish or whatever, it would have to be in a phase blade, which is the only option really for this mercenary. You could potentially go with like a ethereal six-socketed dimensional sword, but dimensional swords are a bit slower, but you would get a little bit better damage output out of them. Unfortunately, Last Wish the damage output is so much lower in a phase blade than it is in something like a Colossus Blade. I mean, you look at the difference there. We've got what 426 to 842, and even the one-handed is 181 to 475. And then you look at the Last Wish phase bladed, and it's 151 to 171, which is it's like not even close. The minimum damage of 181 on the Colossus blade beats the maximum damage on the Last Wish of 171. It's pretty bad. But that being said, Last Wish is an excellent option for this mercenary because it does obviously give them a lot of bonuses. It gives them life tap, gives them fade. It also gives them the level 17 might aura when equipped, which is pretty nice. All in all, it's actually a pretty cool little doojank. I actually really enjoy seeing this on a mercenary, but also the price of this is ridiculous, and it's really for people who are super duper rich. But speaking of what we talked about earlier, so Merc, for the best he can be, can he tank and he stay alive, and utility, right? So the Act 5 dual-wield version, it does have Iron Skin, which makes his defense a lot higher in general than the two-handed variant, which means that he can tank a lot better. He's going to be avoiding hits more than the other mercenaries, and honestly, sometimes all you can really do is avoid hits, especially when it comes to bosses that do like 10 times damage to you. He has Taunt, which is, it doesn't really use it that much, but it is kind of nice to help keep him alive. So between Iron Skin and Taunt, it definitely does help keep him alive tremendously. And of course, he also has Frenzy, which makes him attack faster in general, and a lot of the times he'll hit those max breakpoints for IAS pretty easily without too much help. Some weapons will require some assistance, but for the most part, he can hit it without too much issue. So overall, he has 2 weapon slots, right? So I've done some pretty extensive testing on these dual weapons, and I'm going to bring up some of my testing here real quick. So the first thing I tested was dual head strikers, and that was 14 minutes and 5 seconds. I also tested ohmed versus 1540s, and I hate to tell you guys, but there was no difference between ohm versus 1540s. So you might as well save your 1540s and just throw in an ohm rune, because the damage output difference between the two was actually negligible at best. With the dual head strikers between the 2 different options. And on top of this, another thing that I would recommend is that you would probably be better off with a burr rune in there instead, because one of the things that my raw damage testing really showed was that raw damage really has a limit on how quickly it can potentially kill a monster. And I mean, yes, raw damage can kill weaklings relatively quickly, but for the most part, when you're fighting monsters that have a ridiculously large HP pool, raw damage does have a kind of like a cap on essentially how much it can really dish out. And so adding in a crushing blow to the equation is probably going to have a more dramatic effect on the overall kill speed of tough monsters than the ohm or the 1540 pretty much ever will. Dual Griefs was 10 minutes and 51 seconds, which was actually pretty fast, but not the fastest. Dual Fury Eth Mythical Swords, 20 minutes and 40 seconds. It was pretty bad. One thing I wanted to talk about with Griefs is that Griefs were not working on the Barb Merc for a while. We actually tested this, but they do seem to be working now, so this is something that I want to correct, because I have been spreading this for a while, but they do work now. Which is it's through the testing that I did. It's very obvious that they work. I mean, 10 minutes and 51 versus 14 minutes and 5 seconds on Uber Diablo. This is a pretty stark contrast. I mean, it's about what, 3 minutes? I'll just say 3 minutes. Just average it to 3 minutes. It's about a 3-minute difference in the kill speed. Single grief with a bad secondary weapon, so I basically just use like a blue dimensional sword that I got from the shop, was 17 minutes and 40 seconds. And somebody had brought up the old trick where you could put like a broken weapon or like no weapon whatsoever in the secondary slot, and the game would just simply duplicate your first weapon. And the answer to that question is no, that does not happen. So when I put grief in with nothing or with a broken weapon, I got a worse time than when I did the bad secondary weapon, which I think should conclusively prove. So conclusively proves this trick doesn't work. So keep that in mind, that putting nothing in your secondary slot does not work. Dual Crescent Moons was actually a pretty good setup with 15 minutes and 59 seconds. And of course, this is more utility because you also get the static field proc, which was pretty nice. Grief plus Lawbringer was actually the fastest in terms of raw damage outputs, of course, because you get the Decrepify proc. And the Decrepify proc makes a pretty big difference in the damage output of the character. So if you notice here, Dual Griefs at 1051 wasn't as good as Grief plus Lawbringer. And also, I did Hedge Striker plus Lawbringer, which showed similar results where the Hedge Striker and the Lawbringer was a better combination than dual Hedge Strikers. So it's very important to note here that you don't need two Griefs and you don't need two Hedge Strikers. You really just need a cheap Lawbringer. Lawbringer is a very easy and very cheap weapon to come by. You can put it in a mythical sword. You can put it in a phase blade. Honestly, it really doesn't matter. You probably are better off putting it in a phase blade because the damage output of Lawbringer is absolutely trash. It has no physical damage increase, so you really just want to put it in a phase blade to make it go faster. But you can also put it in a ethereal mythical sword as well. When it comes to these rune words that don't have any damage output, like for instance Voice of Reason or Lawbringer, these two swords don't have any damage output at all. They're probably just better tossed in a phase blade for speed reasons, so that they attack faster. And it really just comes down to the fact that, like for instance with Lawbringer, you're getting the Sanctuary, or sorry, the Decrepify proc. So you want him to attack faster. You want him to proc that effect. He also has fire damage and cold damage, which is not affected by the damage output of the sword. It's only affected by the speed of the sword. So again, similar thing. You want him to attack faster, not the other way around. Voice of Reason also similarly with the 15% chance to cast level 13 Frozen Orb on striking and the 18% chance to cast Ice Blast on striking. And then of course also with the 100 to 220 cold damage. This also is better made in a phase blade. Now I put these in mythical swords and conquest swords and whatnot, and honestly, like, I probably should have thrown it in just a phase blade. And the reason is because you really want to hit those max IAS breakpoints to attack as fast as you possibly can with these weapons. Now, talking about these weapons specifically, though, so if you're going to use one of these zero damage, and I call them zero damage because that's basically what they are by comparison to other options. Like for instance, if I throw this, even in the Conquest Sword, if I throw this Conquest Sword on this Mercenary, and then I throw, for instance, the Grief, which is your highest damage option in his other slot. One of the things you're going to notice is, look, I'm doing 707 to 960. A good deal of that is the cold damage, so I got 100 to 220 cold damage. And then on top of that, there's also some damage output that might be coming from other things like the Venom on striking. But for the most part, this damage is mostly non-physical damage. And you can see that 2,204 to 2,268 from the Grief is way better. Even if I just take the weapon off and I go back to like the base damage of 342 to 363, you can see that the Voice of Reason really isn't adding a whole lot to the equation. So just going with the speed versions of these is much better. And these are actually really good options for the Mercenaries. So if you're trying to set up some sort of utility on the Mercenary, there's a lot of really good ways that you can add utility. Lawbringer obviously adds Decrepify. It also adds an aura, so it adds the Sanctuary aura, which knocks back undead, and it also completely cancels out any physical resistance undead monsters have, which means that he'll pretty much tear through any monsters that are undead and physical immune with relative ease. Voice of Reason is extremely useful for, obviously, freezing targets. So if you throw this on a Mercenary, you get the Frozen Orb on striking and the Ice Blast on striking, which is going to make it so that he's dishing out a pretty nice chilling effect, essentially. Of course, I only had 1 HP because I literally just set up my character. That's hilarious. How about that? I'll punch you in the face. Let's go look at his Frozen Orb on striking. I would never put 2 of them on him, though, and this is very important, because the damage output of the swords is so low that no matter how much life leech you have, it's not going to be enough. And this is one of the biggest issues with Lawbringer and the biggest issues with Voice of Reason and pretty much any other weapon in this category that has relatively zero physical damage, but also has a really high amount of like elemental damage or proccing effects, is you're not going to get the the life leech that you need to keep your mercenary alive, so he's just going to die all the time. So you always want to pair these up with something else, like a grief or a head striker, or like a crescent moon, or something that actually has a damage output. And you see he has frozen orbs that he'll be shooting out. This is a very nice one for trying to keep your mercenary alive as well. So tankiness reasons, just in general. So when he's fighting monsters, he's obviously going to be able to chill them and freeze them, and it's going to obviously help his damage incoming. So he's taking a lot less because the monsters are going to be frozen a lot. They're going to be chilled a lot, and it's just generally going to keep him alive better. Another, like I said, the other really good option, which is Lawbringer, and I do really recommend the Lawbringer, is because it obviously has the really nice Decrepify proc. Now, a little annoying is the Sanctuary Aura, and the Sanctuary Aura will knock monsters back. So when you go to like an area with undead monsters, Arcane Sanctuary is a good place. So when you go to like Arcane Sanctuary, for instance, and you're over here fighting the monsters, you're going to notice that he's going to start knocking back everything away from you. Because the Sanctuary Aura, of course, every single time it pulses, is going to knock the monsters away. Which is going to cause some nastiness in terms of things like when you knock, say, Grand Visor of Chaos off the cliff or something like that. It's definitely going to be a little bit of a pain in the butt. But as you can see, he can just like rip straight through pretty much all of those monsters without any problem, utilizing the Grief and the Lawbringer combo. It's a pretty solid setup. One thing that does have to be said about this sword, though, is that despite the fact that this is the highest damage option in combination with the other high damage options, since it does have Decrepify, it can be an issue if you are trying to keep a curse on a monster. So, like, for instance, let's say you're trying to fight Uber Diablo, or you're trying to go into Uber Tristram or something like that. You bring your mercenary with you. The Decrepify will overwrite Life Tap or any other beneficial curses that you might be using, which could get you killed. So it's also important to think about that as well, is that you may not necessarily want Decrepify on your mercenary. So keep that in mind. Moving forward from there, it's kind of the same situation as before, though, is that Crushing Blow, there's basically no Crushing Blow on Grief, and unless you throw a Burr Rune in Head Striker, there's no Crushing Blow on Head Striker either. And there's not a lot of really good options for Crushing Blow on the Dual-Wield Barbarian. Last Wish, which I was talking about earlier, is probably one of the best Crushing Blow options because of the relatively ridiculous 70% Crushing Blow that it has, along with the other really nice effects, of course, of having the Might Aura, giving him Fade, and then, of course, you also get Life Tap. But then the problem with that is you can't really run it with Lawbringer, because Lawbringer has Decrepify, and the Life Tap and the Lawbringer will basically fight with each other for damage output. Notice also that the damage output of Last Wish isn't really that good. We were talking about Lawbringer being a relatively 0 damage weapon, or Voice of Reason being a relatively 0 damage weapon, right? But look at the damage output comparatively to Last Wish. 1,296 to 1,631, and Last Wish is 1,749 to 1,920. Last Wish in a Phase Blade is actually pretty pathetic. It does have, obviously, the really, really, really nice other effects. It has the secondary effects. It's got the Life Tap. It's got the Fade. It's got the Might Aura. It's got the Crushing Blow. Prevent Monster Heal doesn't work on the Mercenary, by the way. It's got the Hit Blinds Target. All of it, which is very nice. And it's a very fast weapon, too, because it's made in a Phase Blade. But you really can't put this in just about any other base. The only other base that you could potentially use this in is an Ethereal Dimensional Sword, which might be a little bit higher damage, but it would also technically be slower, too, which is another problem. What else are we looking at here? Trying to make sure we're covering everything. Plague. Yes, Plague. I love Plague. Plague is one of my favorites for this mercenary. So, Plague offers some very interesting options when it comes to the mercenary. Not only does it obviously give a strong utility, but Plague Blade actually has pretty decent damage output. It's 219 to 315. Definitely a lot better than, like, the Last Wish, which is only 151 to 171, and it's also pretty much way better than Lawbringer or Voice of Reason in terms of physical damage output. It also gives plus to skills. It gives lower resistance when struck, which is really, really effective for casters. And honestly, just as effective as Conviction, if not more effective than Conviction in most scenarios, with the exception of monsters that are not immune to your attack. But here's the interesting thing about lower resistance versus Conviction. They're pretty much the same. When you're dealing with monsters that you can kill easily, Conviction is better. But at the same time, when you're dealing with monsters that are not immune to an element, you really don't need Conviction. When you're dealing with monsters that are immune to an element, they basically do the exact same thing. The other interesting thing about lower resistance is that lower resistance lasts for longer and stays active on the monsters for a longer period of time, which is certainly very nice. Now, a downside of Plague is that, again, like the Lawbringer with the Decrepify, is that lower resistance can potentially override beneficial curses, so it's important to take this off of your Mercenary if you're doing Ubers and you need Life Tap. The Poison Nova on Striking is actually kind of nice, too, to help arrest regeneration. It's not going to kill it entirely, but having a constant Poison Nova going off on a regular basis definitely doesn't hurt. It also has the negative 23% enemy poison resistance, which helps in that regard. And it also has freezes target and open wounds, as well as deadly strike. It's a very, very effective weapon for the Mercenary. The cleansing aura at low is probably my favorite part of this, because the cleansing aura gives your Mercenary basically a free pass when it comes to poisons, which are very deadly to mercenaries. It also gives him a free pass for the effects of curses, which means that curses and poisons last basically no time on him, and they also last no time on you. Trust me, if you have a cleansing sword on your mercenary in a group, you are a well-loved member of the group, because cleansing is just extremely useful to everyone nearby. On top of this, cleansing actually, the Plague Sword actually does have damage output, which means that you can combine it with other non-damage output options. I wouldn't probably put it with a Lawbringer, because then you would just be going lower res, Decrepify back and forth, which I don't know if that's really going to be very useful for most people. But Voice of Reason is definitely an option, because Voice of Reason is obviously going to give you a pretty decent damage output in a secondary form. On top of that, the lower res proc is obviously going to give you... Where did I put my Voice of Reason at? It's on the ground. Dynamite. There it is. So Voice of Reason is going to give you a pretty nice boon with this weapon as well, because in general, when you're talking about... I already had Voice of Reason on. When you're talking about Voice of Reason, you've got obviously your Frozen Orb and Ice Blast, and they actually do pretty good cold damage, right? And you also have negative cold res on the weapon. So this sword with the negative resistance of lower resistance curse, and the obviously the negative resistance from cold res, and then the cold attacks along with the cold damage, makes for a pretty solid combination in terms of elemental damage output and physical damage output. You'll notice, however, though, that a lot of these weapons just don't have any life leech on them. Going over all the options. Last Wish does, because it has life tap, but I don't really think Last Wish really counts. But you look at Head Striker, no life leech. Crescent Moon. Crescent Moon doesn't have any life leech either, and it's a really good option, by the way. Lawbringer, it has life leech, but it only applies to itself, and it basically does no damage, so it doesn't count. We've got the Fury Swords have life leech, but these ended up being one of the worst options for the mercenaries, although it does have really nice open wounds, which is kind of neat. And then you go over things like Voice of Reason, no physical damage output, and no life leech. And then, like Grief, obviously, no life leech on Grief either, but it does have life after kill, which I guess could be slightly helpful. But overall, when you look at the different options of the sword, you basically have no life leech on pretty much any of the sword options that you can potentially use, which is kind of crappy. You also got Hustle. Hustle is an interesting one to speed up your Merc, like, significantly. So if you want to give him just extremely fast attacks, Shioko Eld. You probably want to throw this in like a Lawbringer, or sort of like a mythical sword though, an F mythical sword, so you get better damage output. I don't know. The hustle that I have right here is probably for a player, not for the mercenary. But the fanaticism aura and the burst of speed are actually really effective for increasing the damage output speed-wise on the mercenary. Not really that effective for players though. The fanaticism aura at level 1 has basically no range. And it's very, very difficult to actually get any usefulness out of it. It's really just for the person that's actually wielding the weapon, which is, that says +3 bow and crossbow skills on it. I must have converted this from a bow using Hero Editor. That's probably what I did. That's hilarious. So anyway, my point is, there's really no life leech options on the weapons, which means that you're pretty much going to need life leech no matter what, coming from either your armor or your helmet, and there are some pretty decent life leech options for that. The first and probably the best armor option is the Bone Flesh Hellforge Blade, which is basically double upgraded and ethereal. It offers a socket, which of course means you can put even more doojanks in here. You can put 50% IAS jewels. You can throw a burr rune in for damage reduction. You can put a shale rune in for more, faster hit recovery and so forth and so on, which is actually a pretty decent choice if you need life leech on your actual armor. For the helmet slot, there's a couple different options for life leech. Obviously, you have the bulwark, which is a really solid option these days because it has life leech and physical damage reduction, which puts it leagues ahead, honestly, of a lot of the other options that you could potentially use. The Ariat's Face is an absolutely excellent option as well for the increased attack speed that you can do because you could socket it with an IAS jewel, but it doesn't have any physical damage reduction. You could, of course, put a burr in there, but then it wouldn't have any IAS. But it is a pretty solid option if you have it laying around. I do still prefer Bulwark these days on my mercenaries, just simply because it's kind of hard to beat 15% physical damage reduction, 5% increased maximum life, life leech, and obviously the DR and the faster hit recovery. It's a really nice all-in-one package. Ariats does have a better resistance profile, though. So if you need to cap out your resistances, it does help out really nicely with that.
I'll put that to good use.
You can also obviously do Cure Helmet, and you can stack up even more Cleansing Aura, but with the Plague Sword, I kind of just prefer the Plague Sword for my Cleansing Aura, because I think Plague's Cleansing is just way better anyway. You could also double up on Plague Swords, so you can get, like, absolutely ridiculously level Cleansing Aura to really cleanse off those poisons, and it actually does work really well, by the way. Another Life Leech armor option, of course, is the Chains of Honor, which I just had over on the other character. But so I got my Treachery, we got Hustle. Hustle's okay for the increased attack speed and the evasion. The evasion actually works surprisingly well to keep the Merc alive while they're running around. And Chains of Honor is a pretty solid option too. Let's go grab that so I can show that. It's kind of hard to understate how good Chains of Honor is on these mercenaries, and I feel like we need to go over this in terms of the effectiveness that the Chains of Honor provides. So Chains of Honor gives you not only the life leech, which turns it into a life leech armor. It gives you resistances, which caps out your resistances. It gives you physical damage reduction of 8%, so you get a nice 8% DR there. And on top of that, you also get a really nice 200% damage to demons and a 100% damage to undead, which basically means that Chains of Honor can compete with something like Fortitude in terms of damage output, mainly because Fortitude gives you, of course, 300% physical damage increase, right? Well, 300% physical damage increase, while it is certainly very nice, is essentially the same thing as the 200% damage to demons that you're getting from the Chains of Honor, and you're also getting the Life Leech, and you're also getting the physical damage reduction. And you can see how the two armors side by side are still pretty close together. Now, granted, Fortitude does give you a lot more defense, but the dual wield variant doesn't really need the defense because Iron Skin already gives him a really nice bonus defense. So when you put something like Chains of Honor on the Merc, they're already sitting at like 11,000 defense anyway. Now, granted, Fortitude will make that even higher. So if you throw a really nice Ethereal Fortitude and a Sacred Armor on a Mercenary with 2,850 defense, and then they go proc their Chilling Armor bonus, which, let me see if I can get this Chilling Armor bonus to proc. Let's try Frigid Highlands. He's over here just murdering everything before they can even touch him. Let's see if we can get him up here in the packs. There you go. Surround him. Surround him. He's got so much defense, I don't know if they can touch him. Kind of got to pull off some of his... there we go. So now he's got, as you can see, he's got 23,621 defense, which is so much defense that pretty much nothing in the game is going to be able to hit him for the most part, with the exception of, like, really, really high-level monsters. Physical damage, of course, mainly ranged attacks and melee attacks. Spells are still going to get through it without any issue. So Fortitude in a Sacred Armor is definitely a really tanky option because, of course, he's going to get the damage bonus, and, of course, he's going to get the defense bonus as well. But when you use Fortitude and you use these weapons, you are now limited from being able to use something like G-Face, because G-Face, of course, doesn't have any life leech. Your armor doesn't have any life leech. And your weapons don't have any life leech. So now you are stuck with only life leech options for your helmet, which means you pretty much are choosing between something like Bulwark, which is a really nice life leech damage reduction option. Your Ariat's Face, which is going to give you your life leech or your damage reduction. Another potential option, which I don't really like using anymore, is Andariel's Visage. Now, I have talked about Andariel's Visage on many occasions for... some mercenaries. Like, for instance, the Act 1 mercenary, I think Andy's Visage is still a decent choice. But for the Barb mercenary, I don't really feel like the Andariel's Visage is a better choice than Bulwark, mainly because of the damage reduction. The 15% damage reduction is extremely important for keeping your mercenary alive. Andariel's does have one thing that Bulwark and Ariat's Face and basically any of the other life leech options don't have, which is more attack speed. So if you want to use Andy's Visage with a 15% IAS jewel, you can get up to 35% increased attack speed with life leech. So if you're trying to set up an extremely fast build for, dishing out as much, like hits as possible, not exactly damage, but hits as possible, then Andy's is going to be a really good choice for damage output in terms of speed. One of the main problems with this, though, is that if you're utilizing phase blades, like, for instance, if you're using a Grief Phase Blade, you're pretty much already capped out on speed anyway with the Grief Phase Blade. However, if you are utilizing other options like Conquest Swords, Mythical Swords, and even, what's the other one, the Cryptic Sword, they are slower options, and because they're slower, you may want to consider a speed-based approach for damage output. Like, for instance, if you're using Voice of Reason and you're trying to get as many Frozen Orbs and Ice Blasts, well, you're probably going to make that in a Phase Blade anyway, but going as fast as you possibly can is going to get you more of those procs. Same thing for items like to Crescent Moon. Now, I didn't talk about Crescent Moon yet, so let's talk about Crescent Moons. Crescent Moons are actually surprisingly amazing damage pumps. Not only do they obviously give you the really nice Chain Lightning proc and the Static Field proc, which is going to massively decrease the amount of HP that the monsters have relatively quickly in a large group. And this is something that we really need to consider when it comes to choosing your weapons for these particular NPCs. Are you trying to focus on single target damage, or are you trying to focus on AoE damage? Because the truth of the matter is that no matter how amazing Grief is, no matter how amazing Head Striker is in terms of their physical damage output, they're still only hitting one monster at a time. Whereas when you put something like Crescent Moon on the Mercenary, especially like dual Crescent Moons, the Crescent Moons are going to offer a much better AoE damage effect, which means that you're going to get that nice static field proc going off on the entire pack of monsters, as opposed to just simply one or two monsters at a time. And as you see the static field proc, you'll notice that the monsters nearby are getting hit by an amazing level of damage output. And let's see if I can... There we go. So as you can see, Static Field is already proccing on most of these monsters. You can see they got their HP is pretty low. And of course, I ain't got no equipment on myself. I'm out here dying left or right because I got no HPs. Well, I got 2,000 HP. What am I even going down here for? To get my body back? My body of nothing? I've got nothing. There's nothing on my body. I just came all the way back down here to get my body of nothing. Let me let me take this too. Where should we take this that doesn't have a huge number of imps to pester me? Let's see. Let's go to, you know what, let's go to Arcane Sanctuary. That's a good place. Arcane Sanctuary is always fun. Alright, so you get your Mercenary in there, and one of the things you're going to notice with the static field is that immediately, like, he's already got most of these monsters down to a relatively low HP. The huge amount of negative resistance on Crescent Moons also offers a very easy time dishing out lightning damage. The Chain Lightning does good damage. The static field actually gets a better, it's more effective because of that negative resistance. And on top of this, they also actually have damage output. Unlike a lot of the other proccing options, the static field on these is actually pretty amazing and offers them AoE damage, which is going to help out your character. So another really good thing to think about is, like, when you're talking about utility, like, are you a single target damage character? Because if you're a single target damage character, maybe you just want a mercenary who's going to help you dish out damage in a larger area. And having a static field Crescent Moon Barbarian is a really good combination. Now, you can obviously just use one. That's also an option. But the negative resistance that you get from both makes these extremely effective, and taking away one of them is going to reduce the effectiveness tremendously. But a good combination, obviously involves Crescent Moon or Lawbringer or something of that type. In my opinion, you should pretty much always be utilizing one damage sword, so a sword that actually does damage output, and one non-damage output weapon, because it really seems to be the best combination for these particular characters. So Crescent Moon, while it is absolutely amazing, could be paired up with any number of swords. Like, you could throw a Grief with it. You could throw a Head Striker with, like, a Burr Rune. You could put a Plague Sword with it, which is a pretty good combination as well, because you get your low resistance proc, get your Poison Nova. It's just a really solid option for the mercenaries. I think Crescent Moon really makes a lot of sense in terms of damage output. Not only obviously AoE, because level 13 static field, it does a really nice, obviously reduction in HP of all the monsters nearby. And even in high difficulties, I think that's one of the really cool things that you'll notice is that, like, if you throw 2 Crescent Moons on, let's bump this up to P8 from the rookie number. I clicked on Nightmare, didn't I? I did indeed. Faster, faster, faster. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. Alright, so let's go back to Arcane Sanctuary. And let's do it again. Why not? So let's just have these guys fight again. So here we go. We got a whole bunch of ghosts, and we got some other monsters. So we're just going to have him working in here with his Crescent Moon. Now, he's obviously not going to dish out any damage to these specters because they're immune to physical. He does, however, have open wounds from the Crescent Moons, because the Crescent Moons are obviously, they have, 25% open wounds on them themselves. As you can see here, he's actually dishing out a pretty decent amount of damage because of the static field, the Chain Lightning, basically the little proccing effects that he has. It allows him to dish out enough damage to even, like, P8 monsters that he can kill larger packs with relative ease. It's not going to be, like, the end of the argument. Obviously, you're going to have to apply some additional damage once Static Field does its work. But having Static Field apply to the entire pack of monsters that you're fighting is tremendously effective in terms of damage output. Now, of course, if you wanted Static Field, you could also potentially go with the Act 3 Static Field version, which is another choice. But maybe you want a tank and you want Static Field, because the Act 3 version is not going to be a very good tank. I mean, let's be honest. Treachery is obviously a really good option if you early on, if you just want increased attack speed. It also gives you Fade, which is going to be really nice for the 15% damage reduction. Again, the same thing I was talking about earlier when it comes to Fade. If you're doing quick farms, it's not going to be as useful because during quick farms you might not get your Fade to proc, and so it's not really going to help you out much. Hustle is a cheaper option. Earlier on, and it does give the +6 to evade, which can make him pretty tanky as he's running around. It also gives 40% increased attack speed and 65% run walk, which is kind of neat. I think that Treachery still kind of wins over Hustle, but they're definitely similar options. Speaking of options, G-Face is probably one of the better options for this mercenary because unlike the raw damage options, G-Face is going to give him a relatively large amount of crushing blow. One thing that you have to know about weapons is that when you put a weapon on a monster, or sorry, a mercenary or a player, the weapon only provides its benefits to itself, depending on what the benefit is. So going over Crescent Moon, 10% chance to cast level 17 Chain Lightning only applies to the weapon. 7% chance to cast level 13 Static Field only applies to the weapon. 20% IAS only applies to the weapon. ITD only applies to the weapon. Negative 30% enemy lightning resistance, 35% enemy lightning resistance applies to all weapons. 25% open wounds only applies to the weapon. 11 magic absorb applies to the character. Obviously, you can see how there's an issue here in terms of like how the damage is outputted. Even if you're using something like Last Wish in a Phase Blade, Last Wish in a Phase Blade is going to provide you with a really massive 70% crushing blow. But it only applies it to that one weapon. So your other weapon, like if you were using, say, a Crescent Moon in the other slot, is not going to get that 70% CB. However, if you're using something like G-Face, G-Face is going to give you that 35% crushing blow and that 15% deadly strike to both weapons. Which means that even something as humble as a Lawbringer, which is going to be only there to give you the Decrepify proc and, say, apply elemental damage, can also apply Crushing Blow. So when you're utilizing something like G-Face, you're going to be able to give yourself Crushing Blow to both swords instead of just one, which is extremely effective. And 35% Crushing Blow is really nice. Now, the problem, of course, with using G-Face is that now you are limited from using Fortitude, which is obviously not going to work because you don't have any life leech. Without any life leech source of any type, you are stuck with life leech armor options. And as we talked about earlier, that basically your two main life leech armor options are Chains of Honor, which is going to give you a pretty nice damage bump and life leech and physical damage reduction, or you could go with Bone Flesh, which is going to give you open wounds and IAS. I like the Bone Flesh option because the open wounds on IAS is really effective, but you may already have open wounds from one or both of your weapons, so keep that in mind. So for instance, if you're using, say, Crescent Moons already have open wounds on them of a 25%. Fury has the 66% open wounds, and there's definitely a lot of various options. You could also potentially take a Head Striker and put a rune in it, which would give you open wounds as well. So getting open wounds from Bone Flesh is not the only way, and you might not necessarily need open wounds if you're applying open wounds and prevent monster heal yourself. So also keep that in mind. So between your HP stealing options for armor, you really just have Chains of Honor and Bone Flesh. Now, some people like to point out, like, technically there's other HP armor, steal armors, like there's the Skin of the Flayed one. It's a terrible choice for mercenaries for the most part. And also Greyform Quilted Armor, which has basically no defense, and it's a terrible option for mercenaries later on. Now, those are decent budget options. If you just have them laying around, they could be helpful, but not my personal favorites. So what is the best setup for the Act 5 mercenary? There really isn't one. I hate to tell you this, but there really isn't one. It really comes down to what you need. If you're an energy shield sorceress, I would highly recommend that you look at Plague because the cleansing aura is going to help you tremendously versus those poisons and curses, which are the bane of your existence. If you are a highly single target character and you just have a lot of trouble dishing out damage in a significant way, Crescent Moon can definitely help you in that terms of having like AoE damage output, because obviously being able to static field everything nearby is going to be a pretty massive boon for a single target character. On top of this, maybe you just want a tank. Maybe you just want like the most ridiculous tanking mercenary that you can possibly get. Well, things like Fortitude obviously are going to help out tremendously in the tanking department. You can also utilize, physical damage reduction like Bulwark with a 15% DR. You can add in even more DR from other sources like Chains of Honor and so forth. And it really depends on what you're tanking, which is also an issue. So it's important to note that if you're tanking physical damage reduction is pretty much king in this regard. So if you're trying to set up a mercenary for tanking, say, I don't know, let's say you're trying to tank cows. Cows are almost entirely physical damage, and in that case, you're probably better off with a nice ethereal shaft stop. Ethereal shaft stop is a really, really solid option for cow farming because of that high physical damage reduction. And of course, you could pair it along with a really nice bulwark with a 15% damage reduction, and your mercenary will be sitting at a very solid 45% damage reduction between the two. Physical damage reduction, and if you put a last wish in there, he'd be pretty much invincible. Now that's obviously not going to help him versus elemental damage. If he's fighting something like Travancore Council, you're better off with elemental damage protection. And elemental damage protection comes from other types, like, for instance, an Ethereal Guardian Angel Hellforge Plate is a really good choice. Now, if you're going to use the Ethereal Guardian Angel Hellforge Plate, it gives you a higher resistance cap, but you notice that his resistances are not capped. So if you're using the Ethereal Guardian Angel Hellforge Plate, you're probably better off tagging that along with something that's going to give you resistances, like, for instance, Ariet's Face will give you some resistances, or you could use a Kira's Guardian. There's a lot of different options for resistances in terms of tankiness. And of course, giving him things that are going to help him in terms of his tankiness is a big deal. Like, for instance, Voice of Reason is obviously going to help him with tanking because it will freeze things. Maybe you don't want him to freeze things, though, because maybe you're horking. And in that case, Voice of Reason might not be a good choice. But Voice of Reason does have Cannot Be Frozen. It also has 2 forms of freezing effects, which will cause the monsters to get nice and chilly. Plague also has a freezing effect on it, a +3, which will chill targets and keep them slightly, under wraps. And then on top of that, you can also utilize things like Hustle Armor, which will give him a little bit more tankiness as well in terms by giving him the Evade skill. All in all, I think when it comes to building a tanky mercenary, your best combination is probably going to be a Fortitude, which is going to give him a massive defense bump, combined with some sort of weapon, which is going to make him even tankier. So, for instance, Voice of Reason would be a very good choice. I would probably put it in a Phase Blade, not a Conquest Sword, but that's what I have it in here. And then to pair that up with a really nice high damage weapon like Grief, which is going to give him a large amount of lifesteal. You also could potentially pair up Grief with a Last Wish, which would make him even more tanky by giving him, obviously, the Fade ability as well as the Life Tap. And honestly, when you're talking about tanky mercenaries, this is probably your best combo in terms of like a ridiculously almost nigh unkillable merc. Because with the Grief, you have high physical damage, which is going to give you a tremendous hit. With the Bulwark, you're going to get your Life Leech, which means that tremendous hit is going to provide a lot of HP back in return. Last Wish is going to give you, obviously, Life Tap, so it's going to give you even more damage in return, and you're also going to get your Fade proc, which is going to give you your resistances and your physical damage reduction. And then on top of that, you're also going to have the ridiculous 70% crushing blow on the Last Wish, combined with the hits blinds target, and then the physical, the defense coming from Fortitude and the physical damage increase. In general, I think with this setup, your mercenary probably would be able to survive even something like Uber Diablo. Now, I'm not sure about P8 Uber Diablo, so let's change this down to P1. And let's go give it a try real quick. So we're just going to take this. We're going to sell this to the NPC. And let's see how he tanks Uber Diablo. Let's put our ridiculous tanking armor on so we can survive. I'm so curious. I want to see how well he does against Uber D. Alright, can you solo Diablo? Let's go ahead and punch him for the open wounds. I've got 100% open wounds on the armor, so we can utilize the punching effect. Oh no, he's getting his booty cheeks clapped. Booty cheeks, booty cheeks. Well, he managed to heal himself back up relatively quickly. That was kind of impressive. His fade hasn't procced yet. The life tap hasn't procced. So it looks like he's having trouble getting his procs off. Let's see if we can obviously get his fade procced first before we take him down there. That fade's going to make a pretty big difference in terms of his physical damage reduction. Definitely help him out a lot. Let's go. Let's get wailed on by, say, the Spectres. Alright, so he's got his defense, but he still doesn't have his fade. What's the percent chance on Last Wish for fade? It's 6% chance when stuck. Yeah. Let's find him some more ghosts so we can get and some spells too. That'll help out a ton. Watching paint dry. We're watching paint dries, boys. That 6% chance to proc fade sucks. I mean, I guess I could take off his armor. Let's take off his armor. That'll probably help out a lot. Bring down his defense down quite a bit. There we go. Alright. Now get to work, sir. Punch, 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 punchy, punch, punch, punchy, punchy, punch, 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 punchy, punch, punchy, punchy, punch, 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 punchy, punch, punch, punchy, 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 punch, punchy, 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 punch. Well, he's not quite as tanky as I thought. I think honestly it mainly comes down to the fact that he's missing. I think he's just missing like a ton. Attack rating is a really big consideration when it comes to melee characters, and Uber Diablo is definitely one of the hardest to hit melee characters within the game. He's actually tanking it in there pretty well. I mean, he hasn't died yet. Punch, 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 punchy, punch. Can't hit him with my punch, 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 punchy, punch. Punchy, punchy, punch. I got 24,975 attack rating, and I still can't hit him half the time with my punches. That should go to tell you that obviously connecting physical hits on monsters like Uber Diablo is relatively difficult, and that's one of the main reasons why the mercenaries die a lot of the times, is that they really can't hit them. And on top of that, they also take 10 times the damage output. If you guys aren't aware of this, act bosses dish out 10 times damage to mercenaries. It's kind of insane. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we can cover with these mercenaries. I know this has already been like an hour and 12 minutes, but I did have to cover 2 different mercenaries, which is kind of important. Budget equipment is obviously going to be a whole other category, and if we're talking about budget equipment when it comes to these mercenaries, I mean, there's a lot of budget options that you could potentially use. It really comes down to whether you're trying to get the speed output. Another really important thing that you've got to consider with these guys is what are you providing to the mercenary? If you're a barbarian, you could potentially be providing them with shouts. If you're a paladin, you could be providing them with a fanaticism aura. And if you're providing them with fanaticism aura, well, then they don't need increased attack speed. So items like 15% IAS jewel in the G-face becomes kind of obsolete because they've already got a massive amount of increased attack speed from other sources. You don't necessarily need to throw something like treachery or hustle on them because they've already got a huge amount of increased attack speed. Maybe you're providing them with concentration aura if you're a hammered in, or maybe you're providing them with, like the Heart of the Wolverine, or huge amounts of increased life by using Heart of the Oak and various things. Or maybe you're a necromancer and you're providing them with decrepify, or you're providing them with lower resistance. In which case, some of these options just become obsolete. Like, for instance, if you're a necromancer and you're providing them with lower resistance, well, then you don't really need the lower resistance that comes from plague. If you're a paladin and you're utilizing a fanaticism aura, well, then you really don't need the hustle fanaticism aura. And it really comes down to that sort of scenario. Like, you don't need open wounds if you're providing open wounds to the target. Maybe you're using Drax or you're using something like that. You don't really need to worry about life tap. So you don't really care about the life taps that's being provided for you from the other weapons. Lawbringer, of course, is really nice. But again, if you're a necromancer providing decrepify, or if you're a necromancer providing amplify damage, then you don't really need that either. Also, Decrepify is inferior to Amplify damage in terms of damage output, so you definitely wouldn't want Decrepify overriding your amp. Decrepify is really nice for survivability, though, which is a whole nother category, and so, of course, adding Decrepify in is going to help your survivability on the Mercenary tremendously. Honestly, I can't really speak up or talk up Lawbringer enough. Because in the testing, not only did Lawbringer just perform better than most of the other options, but the Decrepify aura, of course, gives your Mercenary more survivability, more damage output, and more damage output also translates into more damage, which means more life leech, which means more survivability. So tagging a Lawbringer on your Mercenary, especially in a phase blade, which is probably your better bet, is a phase blade, is going to get you a pretty effective Mercenary for relatively cheap. And although Grief is kind of expensive, a Head Striker is, in the testing, proved to be pretty much identical damage-wise. I mean, we're talking about like a 3-minute difference over a really long fight. So having a nice ethereal Head Striker as opposed to a Grief is really not going to be that much of a difference. So a really good budget option for this Mercenary is a nice a Phase Blade Lawbringer and an ethereal Head Striker, preferably socketed with something nice. You don't have to put a Burr Rune in there, obviously, but you could throw a 15% IAS Jewel with some other effects, a Shale Rune, which would increase the attack speed. You could also potentially throw an Rune to give it open wounds. There's a lot of various options that you could potentially do, but pairing those two up together seems to be the best physical damage output setup that you're going to get. Lawbringer also obviously offers its utility as well with the Decrepify aura, and you can't really pair up Lawbringer with something like Voice of Reason, though, so that's kind of something you might want to think about. Elemental damage options, there's obviously a lot of various elemental combinations that you can do. You can do Voice of Reason with something like Crescent Moon, which is another physical damage weapon that actually is pretty good. So you can pair up Crescent Moon and Voice of Reason. You can also pair up Plague and Voice of Reason, which is a really nice combination as well. And you can also pair up Plague and Crescent Moon, which is a really nice elemental damage setup options. Honestly, the really big takeaway that you need to think about when it comes to this Mercenary, the Act 5 dual wield one-handed Mercenary is probably the most customizable, like, Swiss Army knife of a Mercenary that I've ever come across. He is way more customizable than the Act 2 Mercenary, way more customizable than the Act 1 Mercenary, and I think the only Mercenary that even comes close to customizability with this is the Act 3 Mercenary, but it's still not really even there. And what it really comes down to is just that you have so many various sword options for the Act 5 dual-wield version of the Mercenary, because you can obviously have one really nice weapon that is going to give you your life leech, and you can pair it up with one really nice weapon that doesn't have life leech capabilities, essentially, and is basically more for utility. You can even put on the Last Wish, you can put on Griefs, you can put on all sorts of various beautiful things on the Mercenary to what your specific character needs. Let me give you some hypothetical options, right? So let's say you are a sorceress and you really need a tank, but you would also like some damage reduction, right? So you're going to set him up with a plague sword, because that's going to get you your lower resistance proc. It's also going to get you open wounds, which is going to be a tremendous boon for your sorceress because obviously she doesn't have an open wound source being a caster. So that's a really solid option. You can also pair him up with a G-Face, which is going to get you the Crushing Blow. Again, as a sorceress, you don't really have any Crushing Blow options, so that's a really good option for you. And then on top of that, you're going to pair him up with something like a, in this particular case, probably a Fortitude. Fortitude is going to make him the tankiest option here. I'm trying to think we got Life Leech. We don't have any Life Leech option here, do we? So probably something like Chains of Honor then. So a really solid option for a sorceress would be something like Chains of Honor, Plague Sword, G-Face, and probably something. Well, she doesn't need Static Field because the sorceress already has Static Field. So Crescent Moons are kind of out in that scenario. In which case, you could probably just throw a Grief on there, to be honest with you, so that you can get like the highest damage output, which is going to give the best life leech. And that's a pretty solid combo for a sorceress. However, if you were like a paladin or something that has, say, fanaticism aura, Grief might not necessarily be the best option anymore because the thing about Grief is that it's really fast, right? Well, if you have fanaticism aura, you're probably going to be able to hit the same breakpoints with something like a head striker, utilizing the same thing. So in this particular case, you might not want Grief, and instead you might want something like Lawbringer to give you your Decrepify proc. Combined with, on the Paladin, you could throw in something like a Head Striker with a Burr Rune. Or you could throw in, there's a couple different things. Crescent Moon is a really good option in this scenario because, of course, you get the really nice static field, and you're as a Zealer or a Paladin, you're generally like more single target damage. So you're a Fanaticism, you're hitting single targets, you're not dealing as much AoE damage. So this is going to give you Decrepify to help with your physical damage output. It's also going to give you a static field to help with the AoE damage output, obviously, which is going to be a tremendous boon for your particular character since you're not very good in that particular regard. You don't really need open wounds. You just need your mercenary to stay alive. And as a melee character, you probably don't need him to have Crushing Blow either. So in this case, you'd probably just go with a tankier setup like Bulwark and something like Fortitude so he stays alive as much as possible. Because you don't want him to get hit and you don't want him to die. You just want him to make sure he's proccing that static field and he's proccing that Decrepify, and that's really the most important thing for you. So you got your Fanaticism aura and so forth and so on. Another potentially interesting option is something like a Barbarian. So if you're a Barbarian and you're using a Barb Merc, you're going to be able to provide him, obviously, with all of your beautiful shouts, which means he's going to be extremely tanky anyway. So in this particular regard, when it comes to a Barbarian setting up this Mercenary, you are actually probably looking at something more along the lines of a more offensive setup than a defensive setup, right? So you could put something like, say, Last Wish for the Might Aura.
I can't.
Or you could potentially go with, obviously you got your Grief, which is a pretty decent option as well. Trying to think of like what exactly you would want to do for the Barb Merc, but it really kind of depends on what you're setting up. If you're doing Horking, there are some specific items that you would probably want to avoid because some weapons do have, of course, like freezes target, which is going to shatter corpses. It's important to note that Duress also has cold damage on it that can shatter corpses. It's a decent option, but it's not like one of the best. For Voice of Reason is obviously out if you don't want to shatter corpses. Plague is out if you don't want to shatter corpses. There's a lot of various options that have cold damage on them that you're definitely going to want to like shy away from if you don't want the cold damage shattering the corpses. So it kind of limits your options on the Mercenary when you're trying to think about what specifically you're looking for. I think it covers pretty much everything. If you have a specific setup that you'd like me to try and like formulate your optimal like Merc with, I can try and do that. A lot of people ask me this question and they say, what is the best Mercenary setup? And the answer to that question is there is no best Mercenary setup. It really comes down to what character are you, what aura are you running, what class are you, like what is your character, And then what you do is you set up your mercenary to fit your character as best as you possibly can. And doing that, setting up your character to fit your build as best as you possibly can, is really what it all comes down to. If you don't customize your mercenary to your character, if you're just going with like some generico schmerico build, you're not going to get the best out of your mercenary, and he's not going to be doing, like what you need him to do. However, if you set him up properly to assist you for whatever it is that you're doing, you will make a much better mercenary, a much more effective mercenary. And I mean, I can kind of show you this across the board, like going through all of my mercenaries. If I just pick just like a random one, like Infernus is a good one. So on Infernus, my mercenary is integral to the way that the character is set up and built. Basically, I'm utilizing the enchant aura on this particular mercenary to give my entire army enchant, which allows me to dish out a large amounts of fire damage. I'm utilizing that fire damage through lower resistance and also negative resistance equipment like the Mangsong's Lessons, the Infernal Flame, the Flickering Flame, and so forth and so on, which give me a large amount of increased damage for my minions because that negative resistance applies to my minions. And I'm utilizing him specifically for that purpose. If I go to one of my other characters, like for instance, let's pick, where's my trader? This is my two-handed weapon paladin. He's a two-handed axe paladin, right? Well, he uses thorns, and he also utilizes conversion. So one of the things that I had to think about with this guy was how do I actually make, I stole all of his equipment from one of my other characters, was how do I actually make the character dish out, damage without killing itself? Well, the Act 2 and the Act 5 mercenaries were killing themselves all the time. So I ended up going with an Act 1 mercenary for this reason, because Thorns doesn't work on Act 1 mercenaries, and the Act 1 mercenary would basically not kill himself all the time, which was great. And then utilizing things like Bramble to get Thorns auras was particularly useful with this. And you could, of course, use a Bramble armor on the two-handed or the dual-wield variants of the mercenaries. It'll give you additional incoming damage that way. It's not exactly the best in the world, though, for those mercenaries, because they do have really high defense, and so you get a lot less return on them. But if you are, for instance, a necromancer or a summon druid, and you'd like to use a barb merc, this is actually a really solid option for barbarian mercenaries. And I would be amiss if I didn't talk about this. So we're trying to go over everything, and I know this has already been like an hour and 26 minutes, but it'd be what it'd be. So talking about a completely supportive mercenary that's not really set up for itself, Bramble armor would be a very good option for your main armor, because you would get Thorn's aura. You could use Last Wish in your right slot, which would give you obviously the Might aura. And then you could also pair that up with the Lawbringer, which would give you your Decrepify, as well as your Sanctuary aura, and then you could obviously put like a Cure Helmet on for Cleansing aura, and you would have a mercenary that is providing Might, Thorns, Sanctuary, Decrepify, and Cleansing all in one nice neat little package. And that is a pretty solid setup for a mercenary if you're trying to support a, an army, as an example. And there's no limit, honestly, with the dual wield version of like how many different ways that you could potentially set them up. But as I go through like my characters and I look at all my various mercenaries, you'll find that every single mercenary or every single character that I make has a different mercenary. I'm always setting up my mercenary slightly different for each individual one to customize them for how those characters need to be set up. And when I do tests like this, it often makes you think like, okay, well, best item in the world is, like best damage output is grief, right? But honestly, if you're putting grief on your mercenary as the main weapon, a lot of the times you're kind of doing yourself a disservice, because I don't really think grief is the best option when it comes to a lot of builds. Sorceresses are best off with Plague to help keep the poison from ripping your HP down through your energy shield. Characters that have trouble with AoE damage are not going to get a huge boon from Grief, because obviously something like Crescent Moon with Static Field would be a much better choice. Plague is going to offer things like the ability to apply the lower resistance curse. Lawbringer gives you to Decrepify. You get obviously some really nice crowd control effects from Voice of Reason and so forth and so on. And so raw damage output kind of takes a back seat a lot of the times when it comes to these mercenaries, because Crushing Blow is much more effective at dealing with tougher monsters. Lawbringer is much more effective when it comes to increasing your damage output. Crescent Moon is much more effective when dealing AoE damage. Voice of Reason is much more effective when you're trying to get crowd control added to your mercenary, and so forth and so on. And it really becomes a question of, what do I need out of my merc? And that's why I'm offering for you guys, if you want to make a comment below, like, how best should I set up my mercenary? I will take a look at your build. Make sure that you include a couple things in your post. All right. So if you're going to ask me this, make sure you include these things. So include your class, which is very important. Include your build. So like what kind of character you are. So like let me put like a fake one in here. So let's say I'm a paladin, and then we're going to put in zeal. Fanat, right? So Fanat Zeal. And then we'll say also we're going to throw in what type of damage we do. So type of damage. And this is basically just going to be either physical or elemental. It's basically just going to be what are you going to do. So are you going to be physical or elemental? And if elemental, what type? And this is going to make a big difference in what kind of character you're going to, or what kind of mercenary that you're going to use. Because if you are a physical Zealer, then you're definitely going to want something like Lawbringer in the mix, which gives you your Decrepify proc. If you're an elemental Zealer, like for instance a Holy Freeze Zealer, a Holy Fire or Holy Shock Zealer, in that case you're going to want something that's going to increase your elemental damage, like Conviction, or maybe the Plague Sword, which is going to give you the really nice lower resistance proc. There's a lot of different ways that you could potentially play this. And on top of this, you also have to think not only, and this is really important, so not only like how can my merc buff me, but also you want to think the other side of the equation, which is how can I buff my merc? And this is important when you're trying to consider what it is that you're going to set your merc up for. For instance, if I was a, let's say, class paladin, right? Build Vengeance, right? And then I'm also, not only am I a Vengeance build, but I am obviously using Conviction. So Conviction in here, Conviction, right? So how do I best take advantage of this, which means that my damage type is going to be Elemental / Physical, so I actually have both. And this means that my Merc can definitely be a elemental merc. And this is probably a really good way to play this, because if you have Conviction, Conviction is going to obviously increase the elemental damage of your mercenary. And then on top of that, they're also going to hit more often, which means that in the case of an elemental mercenary, you would probably want to set up something like Voice of Reason, and maybe even tie that together with a Plague, and you have a very effective basically elemental mercenary. But a barbarian dual-wield mercenary might not necessarily be the best choice, because if you're going to be ripping down the resistances of a monster, you could potentially even go with something like an Act 3 mercenary. Act 3 mercenary for static field, which would help you with AoE, or you could go with a fire one, which gives you increased attack rating and so forth and so on. So when you're thinking about this, a lot of the times what you need to do is you need to say to yourself, well, what am I providing my merc? And what is my merc providing me? And usually when you answer these two questions and you answer these questions, you're usually going to come up with a really good response on what type of character or mercenary you're going to want to put. And like I said, if you want to ask a question and I can kind of give you a good mercenary for your build, make sure you put down in the comments what class you are, your build, and also your element type. And I can usually give you a pretty good mercenary to match your character. And honestly, I think you'll be surprised at just how effective mercenaries can be if you do it properly. Anyway, I think that's pretty much it. An hour and 33 minutes is way too long for this, and I'm sure that I ranted and repeated myself many times. This has definitely been one of the more difficult ones, just simply because the dual wield barbarian is so very. What's the term? Has so many options. They have so many options that it's hard to pinpoint them down into one specific option set. I mean, when you're talking about your mercenaries, like having tons of different particular effects, is that you really kind of have to figure out what you want to make your mercenary, how best to make your mercenary, and all this. And it really does end up being a really long and complicated process if you're trying to explain all the options. But trust me, it's not this complicated if you are a specific character and a specific class and you have a specific build, because it narrows down the options tremendously once you decide, what character you're running. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watch my videos, even when I'm ranting for an hour and 34 minutes on the Act 5 Barbarian Mercenary. And as always, keep watching.